Most information in this video is speculation based off of evidence provided by TNT Snowpiercer. Any information not provided by TNT Snowpiercer is taken from 2013 Snowpiercer film by Bong Joon-ho. Anything beyond these two properties is speculation and is not to be taken as official canon. Thank you for listening to this disclaimer. In the year of 1937, one Mr. Joseph Wilford was born in Sheffield, England, some 250 kilometers north of London. The young Joseph was born into somewhat of a prestigious family, having had a large house for him and his family who bore great wealth, which was large enough to afford maids and the latest toy trains of the century, while also likely being able to avoid the struggles of World War II. During his younger years, Joseph's love of locomotives would quickly become apparent, having acquired numerous train sets and a comical dream of wanting to live on a train forever. His love of trains would eventually land him in a newspaper, titling him a whiz kid, likely for his skill in setting up and running his own train sets from a young age without adult aid. Many of the adults in Joseph's life would doubt him mercilessly. Although he was a clever boy, his love of trains was obsessive and easy to mock. Everyone from his family to the other children at school would tease him and berate him for his intellect and obsessions, making him more and more reclusive and less capable of interacting with other people in a healthy way. Luckily, a neighbor in Sheffield would act as an aunt or even a mother-like figure to the burgeoning Wilford. This unnamed neighbor would take Joseph to the parks and chapels of the town and would overall serve as someone he could trust and confide in, as she assured him his dreams would likely come true if he wanted them enough, perhaps spawning an ego and a sense of entitlement in the young boy as he sought to spite those who made fun of him. It is likely that she also is the one who instilled the work, honor, order concept into the young growing boy, as perhaps she is the one who said that if you work hard enough, you can attain anything you want. As he grew older, he began to show a knack for business ventures and would quickly start his own newspaper titled The Wilford News, which would not only report the day-to-day things for the common citizen, but would also be a good newspaper for the common rail fan, which was made ever so obvious by the train art on the title. By the age of 18 in 1955, he had already established himself as a genius man fresh into university. After blazing through school and acquiring what was likely a master's degree in engineering in 1961, he would move on to bigger and stronger fish to fry. As soon as he was able to, Mr. Wilford began chasing his dream of building his miracle train. Not much is known about this era of Mr. Wilford's life, but we do know that he quickly took over the transportation industry and founded the Wilford Industries, establishing control over road, air, water, and rail to the point where it was almost a monopoly. How he did this is unknown, but it was likely that he took advantage of his family inheritance as soon as possible. Although it wouldn't be enough to establish the Wilford Industries, combining it with his business savviness would be more than enough to gain leverage with banks and eventually investors. Before long, Wilford Industries had connected all the railways in the world into one, gaining the right-of-way above all other railways. Even the likes of Canadian Pacific and the mighty Union Pacific trembled in the presence of the great Mr. Wilford, perhaps only being protected by anti-monopoly laws across the globe. However, despite the vast amount of wealth, power, and influence the young billionaire would acquire and the strength of his dreams, it would not be enough. Although he wanted nothing more than to live on a train forever, he was smart enough to understand how impractical it was to do so. Instead of living in the small, inefficient trains of the 20th century, he elected to stay in Chicago and establish his headquarters as he began to build his own trains and rails from the rail capital of America. During this time, Mr. Wilford would adopt a lifestyle comparable to that of Tony Stark or Jay Gatsby. One severe issue that had always plagued Joseph throughout his life was to bond and connect with another human being. Despite being surrounded by dozens of young and magnetic women, Mr. Wilford would yearn for a more exclusive companionship. At some point in time, Mr. Wilford's yearn would eventually be answered by none other than Miss Audrey herself, a money chaser and a singer with a mental stability equal to that of Mr. Wilford. He would quickly become infatuated with her, going as far as learning French from scratch just to understand her music as he grew to enjoy her more and more exclusively, ignoring the other women just to be with her. He'd even go into a state of euphoria as his happiness with her grew, temporarily distracting him from his dreams of the miracle train. Fortunately, or unfortunately if you so choose, Mr. Wilford was not distracted by his relationship with Audrey. It is truly unknowable what kind of relationship Wilford and Audrey had together, but from what we see in the show, Wilford was only partially controlling until much later. 24 years after Wilford began his ventures, Melanie was born on a dirt farm in Pennsylvania in the year 1985. She would live a hard life during her years of development, but would prove herself to be a keen mind, especially in the realm of engineering, having been more than overqualified to fix the farming equipment that her father owned. Her prowess eventually landed her a scholarship from Wilford Industries. During the dusk of the 20th century, Mr. Wilford grew antsy and anxious as he passed over the midway point of his life. He was struggling to find engineers to suit his desires of a miracle train, and he was getting desperate. Melanie was one of many attempts to cultivate this desire, but she would certainly be the last. And even if he failed, he wanted someone who shared his love of the rails, and to potentially hand the keys over to the company when the time came. As Melanie was first given her scholarships, Wilford Industries designs the drawers, a means of long-term survival and cryostasis of some sorts, but one that leaves the patient somewhat conscious and not frozen. The technology was incredibly prototypical, and upon testing it himself, Wilford is not impressed by it, quickly being overwhelmed by the visions and dreams that would haunt patients on Snowpiercer some 20 years later. Unfortunately, the experience would change Mr. Wilford. Nowhere near immediately, but the eccentric man would slowly deteriorate in mental health from both the first-generation drawers and the fear of death without having first lived on his miracle train. He quickly becomes frantic as he burns through his 70s. Mr. Wilford knows there is nothing he can do to stop death despite his vast wealth and power. Melanie would graduate college in 2009 with what was likely a master's degree in engineering. In this year, Mr. Wilford would nearly go insane. All he needed was the proper energy source to build his miracle train. He had the infrastructure and the massive trains to live on, but he lacked the energy production to keep a train moving for as long as he lived. However, just before breaking, as Melanie continues to ascend the ranks of his company, Mr. Wilford would hit gold, the end-all be-all of energy production, the perpetual motion engine. It is unknown when this occurred, but it was likely in 2012 when he did so, if not 2011. With a new energy source in his hands, he and his company designs the grand prototype, Big Alice, which he would flaunt to the world and would announce his discovery in Chicago with the mega train standing behind him, while also announcing his desire to build a self-sustaining ecosystem on rails. Finally, after years and years, Wilford would finally have his childhood dream. He was happy again. However, the scrutiny of such an endeavor had not been escaped. Many would hold the CEO of Wilford Industries under heavy scrutiny. Although almost everyone had admired the self-made, environmentally friendly industrial tycoon of a man, he was 76 by 2013. Many wondered if he was going mad or senile, dripping back at his obsession of the rails in order to cope with his deteriorating mental health. They would be wrong about him going senile. However, Mr. Wilford was beginning to go mad thanks to his fear of death, obsession with his miracle train, and exposure to the first-generation drawers. He was growing more and more controlling of everything around him, and his obsession with living on his miracle train had nearly cost him his sanity. Although it would not be many years before it would be complete, Mr. Wilford was slowly beginning his transformation into what we know today. At some point between then and 2014, Mr. Wilford would meet Melanie for the first time. After learning of her genius in his company, he would quickly put her to the task of aiding him in designing and building his dreamliner after he made the Eternal Engine on March 16th, 2014. During the construction period of the dreamliner, Mr. Wilford would use Big Alice as his mobile headquarters, engaging in parties for days on end. At some point before the dreamliner's completion, Mr. Wilford would engage in his first sadistic act, forcing Audrey to slit her arm. Before this, Mr. Wilford and Audrey had engaged in questionable activities before, but this time it was different. Mr. Wilford would develop a taste of blood after that occasion. It is unknown whether or not Miss Audrey would have her arm cut again after that incident, or if she gave proper consent after finding out Wilford did not want her to die, only that he wanted to know she trusted him with her life. Either way, Mr. Wilford's sadism would bloom into unnatural levels, surpassing whatever kinky pleasures the king and queen of Wilford Industries had engaged in prior. At some point between then and the completion of the dreamliner, perhaps after regretting what he did to Audrey, Mr. Wilford would get insanely drunk and would wander to a motel outside of Chicago, where he would meet Ruth Wardle. There, he would tell her of the train he was building, and when impressed by her quality of service, would hire her on the spot to work in his hospitality department, where she would quickly ascend to the rank of second in command to Kevin McMahon. Although she would desire the position of head of hospitality, she would be content with her position as she cultivated a friendship with Melanie, whom she would see much of as the two of them worked on the train that was built around them. As the dreamliner was built, Wilford and Melanie grew closer. Melanie became something of a daughter to him. However, Melanie was not putting her fullest attention to the company like he wanted her to. Despite his greatest desires, Melanie's attention was split between Wilford Industries and her 2-year-old daughter, who had been born in 2014. Most of Mr. Wilford's lack of empathy for Melanie's bond with her daughter would be a mix of never having had a family of his own while also never having a healthy relationship with the family that he was bestowed. Even though Mr. Wilford cared about Melanie truly, without malice of any kind, he would still try to win her over through varying degrees of convincing to try and officially make her his protege. Luckily, through hopefully non-evil means, or at the very least not questionable, he would manage to pull it off and keep his closest friend beside him up until the completion of the dreamliner in 2017. During the flashbacks we see Joseph and Melanie together, we can see that Mr. Wilford is still quite human by 2017, and likely was hardly a monster outside of his relationship with Audrey, if we assume that his actions on her were non-consensual. However, this flashback would likely be one of the last times we see him in that form. During the party of the first departure, Mr. Wilford would let it slip during his drunk mood that he wanted Melanie to take over for him. Wilford had almost everything he wanted. He had money, fame, millions of supporters, and a perfect partner to fulfill his kinks. All he needed now was a successor. He believed Melanie and Melanie alone had the skills to succeed him and take over the company. He confesses that he has nothing else to live for other than the parties on his dreamliner. But Melanie does not agree with what Wilford has to say in any way. She had already been neglecting Alexandra for the sake of Wilford Industries for a few years at that point and no longer wanted to constantly leave her daughter with her grandparents 300 days a year. Melanie would choose to leave the company to take care of Alexandra after Wilford continued to pressure her. Mr. Wilford had never been told no to before, and now he had been. He felt betrayed by Melanie's almost sudden departure, and although he could not wish her any harm yet, he would take out his anger on Audrey and would begin pursuing his desire for longer life while also brutally punishing anyone who so dared defy him again. Thus, Mr. Wilford begins to resemble what we see in 2031. Wilford would be left to ferment his own insanity for years on end, becoming more and more psychotic and sadistic, and for the first time, mad with power. However, as much as he wanted to control everything around him, the world was simply too big for the billionaire to control. To combat this, he began to draft a rule book and a system for a society to work on his dreamliner for as long as it ran. This system and a rule book, which was to accommodate around 2,800 passengers, including himself, would eventually be used for Snowpiercer. This was at the point where he still had some shred of humanity, as he designed the Constitution with a means of third class gaining equal representation, even equality in general, over the higher classes. He likely kept this hidden as to please whoever would be in first class, likely his investors, which would eventually be the case. While Melanie raised her daughter with her own parents in Pennsylvania, something would be discovered by Wilford that would turn his wanted goal into a needed one. After acquiring a sample of CW6, he learned of another company's plans to cool the heat-ravaged planet with a newly created CW7, which had been shipped to the nations across the world. At first, Mr. Wilford was very pleased by this turn of events. He'd always looked for ways to make his industry more eco-friendly, and after hearing that the damage to the Earth could be reversed, almost excited him, so much so that he wanted to know what the miracle cure for Earth was made of. After having a scientist, perhaps the Headwoods, run tests on CW6, he realized it wouldn't work. He tried to warn the nations who had been told to administer the chemical agent in the atmosphere, even giving speeches to try and warn the people about what CW7 would do, but nobody listened. In fact, it was swept under the rug by massive corporations and lobbyists in the government who wanted to see their agent work over the senile old man's word. Mr. Wilford had indeed lost most of his credibility, even though it wasn't warranted. Unfortunately, only the visionary Mr. Wilford foresaw the future. In 2022, the CEO of Wilford Industries would try and convince Melanie to join him in his attempt to save humanity from what he would call the freeze. His mind was dimming, and he knew he'd need her by his side if he was to survive mentally. And yet, better yet, if he could get her on the last train to Clarksville, she would have no choice but to take over. Mr. Wilford was different from what Melanie left in 2017, but she didn't take much notice. Although she was skeptical at first, when he showed her the evidence, she understood what she had to do. She understood that she had to return to the dreamliner she helped build years before and turn it into the illustrious Snowpiercer, 1,001 cars long. But it wouldn't go smoothly, to say the least. Melanie and Wilford would constantly be at each other's throats, Melanie prioritizing the quantity of life on the train while Wilford sought quality. Melanie clearly hadn't heard that Wilford no longer accepted defiance in his company, although Wilford still had a soft spot for her and was willing to compromise with her, most notably when he sentenced 6 of his jackboots to death for Melanie's geneticist. However, when Melanie made clear that she would not be compromising with Wilford, he grew aggressive and threatened her daughter if she tried to go against his order. Unfortunately, Melanie was no longer his equal or his partner. She gave that up when she left the company. This would turn Melanie into something of an adversary, although not an enemy yet. Although she was pragmatic and cared little for the quality of life, she was biased for family. She could not imagine getting on the train without her family, and she would not let those geneticists on board without theirs. In the final weeks before departure, she would leak the information of Snowpiercer to the public, and it would eventually trickle into notable ears, such as Andre Layton, which is why Melanie so nonchalantly says, "Where else are they going to go?" when Bennett asks how the future tailies knew about the departure time in 2024. She hopes the future tailies can be used as a distraction to get her 12 guests aboard, while also trying to see if she can get more than the 2,800 passengers on the train. Hence why there were means of producing massive quantities of protein bars on the train. But Wilford finds out anyway. And as is his personality, he brutally punishes Melanie for her defiance and kills 2 birds with 1 stone. He decides to not let any of the guests on board, but also prevents the families from freezing to death by ordering his jackboots to execute them. This solidifies Melanie's hatred for Wilford and Melanie knows it. His voice shakes as he realizes how impulsive and stupid his command was, but he refuses to admit any wrongdoing as his ego is too great. In order to escape the situation and perhaps to win Melanie back, Mr. Wilford goes down train to look for Alexandra. In his mind, there is still time to buy back Melanie's trust and turn back the clock to the good old days. In Melanie's mind, there is not. Wilford never valued family, and he certainly didn't when he went for Alexandra, and Melanie believes that the king of Snowpiercer will choose to leave Alexandra and her own parents behind when the time comes. Her plan to distract Wilford with the invaders failed, and now she is forced to find Alexandra herself, even if it means that she doesn't make it on the train before her departure. However, Bennett would convince her to use her colder, logical side, the side of her that she earned from Wilford himself. Instead of going down train to look for Alexandra and her grandparents, she starts Snowpiercer early when Wilford announces his plan to return. With the flick of a switch and the tap of a keyboard, Melanie, Javi, and Bennett become the rulers of Snowpiercer and the remnants of humanity. Just off screen, Wilford holds the hand of the 10-year-old Alexandra. His face turns to shock and disbelief that Melanie would betray him, despite having just saved her daughter. At that moment, Wilford ceases to have any good intentions. He becomes the maniacal man we see in 2031. Any sign of redemption and hope for humanity snuffed out. He quickly formulates a plan for his revenge, and with Alexandra and the help of the 198 passengers that Melanie left behind to die, Mr. Wilford prepares the second great arc train, Big Alice. With help of his crew, they start up Big Alice in a matter of months, and when Snowpiercer passes her first revolution, Big Alice finally makes her departure.